And we want to focus on that aspect, the positive aspects of the oceans and our waters, and how we can be the change we wish to see in the world. So Philippe, can you share with us, as just the beginning here, about the vital role that the oceans play, and for people to understand how the oceans are the source of all the water that's just one water on our planet?
We continue, I think, as a society of terrestrial beings to ignore, forget, whatever it may be, the role that the ocean plays truly in regulating our planet. Every drop of water comes from the ocean through evaporation or evapotranspiration. We have, of course, the regulation of our climate, and of course what that means is our weather, and what that means is the water for the crops of our food and to drink. And so often the ocean is overlooked and forgotten as the central player in so many of the crises that we face. I was just struck, I want to share that anecdote. I'm looking at my grandfather, that like we're still having the same basic conversation we were 45 years ago.
Yeah.
And you look at, the big global conferences like the COPs and et cetera, well, either the biodiversity COP in Montreal that just happened, or the one in Egypt, that the ocean still takes a back seat to conversations about how we solve this big climate crisis that we're facing, this precipitous, catastrophic decline in biodiversity, when it should be front and center. So I know that's what we're here to talk about today, and I'm pleased to be a part of it.
As you said, most people don't realize that the ocean is the largest carbon sink on the planet.
We've been very focused actually on the Southern Ocean in particular over the past 2 years, 3 years. I'm on the board of an organization called Antarctica 2020. And the Southern Ocean is, one of the most important, if not the most important ocean on Earth, largely because of its role in carbon sequestration. Interesting fact, actually, a lot of people think of the Industrial Revolution as the large-scale beginning, or I should say the beginning of a large-scale human disruption of the global carbon cycle. When in fact it predates that by a few hundred years. The largest carbon sink on Earth, single carbon sink on Earth, is in the Southern Ocean, that krill system, where krill consume phytoplankton. Phytoplankton, of course, provide the majority of oxygen on our planet, though much of that is recycled and reused into the ocean. Nevertheless, krill consume phytoplankton. That, of course, the phytoplankton photosynthesizes at the surface. The krill consumes that, and either when that krill dies or when the krill poops, as it descends during the day into the deeper ocean, it is pushing that carbon that then rains down into the bottom of the ocean, where it can sit for hundreds of thousands of millions of years. And then whales eat that krill, and whale poop, it all comes back to poop. Not something you probably expected to hear me say early in the morning, but it does, or from wherever you are, maybe the afternoon or evening. And then that whale poop is rich in iron, and that iron is critical because the ocean is traditionally iron poor, and that iron then feeds the phytoplankton. And it's this feedback loop that sequesters somewhere in the neighborhood of 13 to 15 billion tons of carbon, we think, though I think that's probably a conservative estimate, in the ocean every year. When you think of a whale is the equivalent even of itself, through the carbon that it sequesters in its tissue, the equivalent of thousands of trees, one single whale. And in the 1500s, when Europe really began, and later in the 1700s, the United States got involved, particularly in the 1800s, I should say, in the United States, that really began to be a global leader in whaling. That was the beginning of a large-scale disruption of the global ocean carbon system.
Let's talk about you and one of the products that you've created made out of seaweed, with your SeaWeed Natural products.
Sure. I think one of the interesting things that exists out there that we focus on too often is sustainability. Personally, I think sustainability is a mediocre goal. And what we really need to be thinking about is how we restore these systems. We catch somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 to 2% of the global krill population in the Southern Ocean in some very critical areas like the Antarctic Peninsula, predominantly for supplements, pet food, and fish food for aquaculture. So we are disrupting one of the most important ecosystems in the ocean and on Earth for supplements, pet food, and fish food. It's the definition of stupidity. And so we're launching a vegan algae supplement, omega-3 and astaxanthin supplement later this year that is derived from algae grown in farms in New Mexico and Texas on arid land with brackish water fed by sunlight.
Let's talk about MPAs and the marine protected areas and how effective those solutions are.
MPAs, a big part of the work going forward, again, speaking of hope, reminds me of a story about 5 years ago. My wife Ashlan and I were filming in the Marshall Islands for a Discovery Channel Shark Week special. And we'd heard rumors that sharks around Bikini Atoll, where the United States had conducted about 23 nuclear bomb tests during the 1950s and 60s. And we'd heard rumors that somehow the shark populations were back in this area. And we made it to Bikini and put our gear on and jumped into, a little Zodiac, and immediately the water was frothing with sharks coming up out of the water to see what was there, because not many people go to this area. And we were astounded when we entered the water to find 60 or 70, reef sharks swirling around us. Predominantly a curiosity. Sometimes they got a little bit close, but there were no problems. And what we found, of course, was that by attaching some of these tags, that reef sharks do indeed migrate, in some cases over 100 miles to some of these other atolls. But the basically what we realized was that this area had become a de facto marine protected area because of the radiation over the last 60 plus years. And some of the researchers that we were working with who have been studying this area were talking about, in fact, one quote always stuck in my mind where one of the researchers said, between nuclear Armageddon and people are worse.
As well, let's talk about the youth's role and how they see the world and the oceans and the systems approach and how they have hope and give us optimism for our future.
My grandfather, I remember again, right here, always looking over my shoulder, literally, figuratively here in the office. He, I remember oftentimes he would talk to me when I was younger, about the importance of education in youth. He was a big believer in that, and he was someone who would often say, before we can talk about conservation, we have to talk about education. Frankly, I think of it as one stool is your traditional science-based work, which is critical. If you think of another stool as your more direct conservation action, say protecting land, passing laws, legislative action, etc., you need the third leg in order to prop those up and to support those, and that is a society that cares, and that is driven through and by education. No great social movement in human history has been driven by anyone but predominantly young people. And if we don't have a constituency, again, that cares, we continue, as we have for the past 40, 50 years, to fight over things like the Endangered Species Act, to argue about whether climate change is real or not.
The youth generations have been accused of being so selfish because of the world they've grown up in this world of the phone and digital and social media. Yeah.
What could be more selfish than destroying the planet for our own short-term selfish gain so we can have massive houses, big cars, and all this other nonsense? 50% of the biodiversity is gone in our lifetime. My daughter, my 18-month-old, waddling around out there, has no idea the richness of the world that's been declined. So I think that's far more selfish than a generation that's trying to figure out how to fix that problem. So I would argue that preceding generations are far more selfish in their domination and destruction of the planet. I think about this generation, my generation, and the ensuing generation now of Gen Z. It's a generation of participation. There's no longer this idea that there are these people out there that will save us. We all need to be a part of this solution. And that is really, from an education perspective, what's exciting, what I find hopeful about this generation of young people. They're rolling up their sleeves and they're getting their hands dirty.
And I fondly recall Steve Irwin, the crocodile hunter, who entertained us a bit like your grandfather did, but in an Australian way, with his adventurous activities and of course his storytelling.
Yeah, yeah. I got to work with Steve. We hosted a show together, and he died basically in my arms at the end of that shoot after being stung by a stingray. He was an extraordinary guy. One of those people that was maybe only 10% less enthusiastic off camera than he was on camera.
Thank you, Philippe. Doug, do you want to share with our group about some of the work that you're doing and the partnership you've created with Philippe for ocean restoration and through the investment world?
Yeah, it's there's so much to talk about here, and we couldn't be any more pleased about having this partnership with Earth Echo International. And we, this past June on World Oceans Day, we launched our first exchange-traded fund that trades on the New York Stock Exchange under the symbol AHOY, Ahoy. The Cousteau family and Earth Echo have been a really important part of pulling that together, and we have been on the road over the last year trying to raise visibility for the work that we're doing together.
But I'm very interested in some of these innovative new kind of financial vehicles that are being used to drive conservation outcomes. I know, for example, some of the work that DiCaprio and others have done in the Seychelles to try and buy debt to debt swaps for land and protecting certain areas, etc. But I don't know, Joseph, do you want to mention? Is there something you want to specifically mention?
Yeah, I'll just take 30 seconds, Philip. I sent you my email. Feel free to send me a note after, but we're working with Barbados right now. I mean, blue bonds are great, but it is still just a refinancing of national debt. So the idea of a common asset trust is it's a vehicle to bring more private money into environmental projects. So as I was sharing with Renee, if you owned a hotel in Barbados and I came to you and said, hey, we're going to put $5 million into coastal resilience, we'd like you to put in $1 million. You'd say, well, that comes out of earnings. That's tough. But if I say, listen, we'd like you to invest $1 million, it's going to pay back 1.5%, and you're going to get your $1 million back in 10 years. That comes out of retained earnings, which you might just have sitting in a treasury note anyway, and it's an investment in your asset. So the concept is can you bring more private money into fund larger projects, which of course is sort of desperately needed at this point. But
12, 13 years ago, and they were talking about the annual charitable giving in the United States being private charitable giving somewhere around $100 billion. And then they were like, in financial markets at the time, $35 trillion. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, I want to sit at that table. Like that's a bigger way. Like we're sitting here fighting over the scraps while like the business is happening and there's trillions of dollars going around and we're fighting over hundreds of thousands. And so, yeah, I think that there's just so much opportunity there. It's really exciting to see the innovation that's happening in this, in this space. And, and I do really believe in it also that we need more money invested in trying to solve some of these, like we were saying, this growth thing is.
Philippe, thank you very much. We are extraordinarily grateful for your time. And thank you everybody else for joining today.
Yeah, thank you.
These events are always supposed to be, they're intended to educate and create collaborations. I know for a fact Philippe has educated us today, and it looks like there's been great connections in our chat and our breakout sessions. So really hoping that this has been valuable for everybody, and we'll make sure we see all of you at the next Oceanside chat.